We'll see how we go. Hi, my name's Aiden. Lovely introduction. I'm from UQ, which is just over the river twice, Mod 2. But anyway, I work with a pretty wide range of people on a national environmental health project. The idea is to bring data together from all around Australia and look at population vulnerability. So I've just flashed a range of the, groups that we work with. Just got to give a shout out, I suppose, to some of them. So QUT obviously is my home and where I do my research. We're funded majorly by Frontier SI, who are a group, non-for-profit organisation about, promoting spatial research in Australia. Together, we're working pretty closely with NGIS, who are a group centred around spatial or geospatial development. So they're dealing with a lot of the software side of our work in the project. And then we've got some of our other stakeholders and funders there who are all interested in, what the outputs of our work are. Great. So to go through the challenge of what our digital twin or what our project is about, the idea is that we want to be able to capture a wide range of environmental health indicators and, as we'll discuss in a moment, indices at a national level that are at a pretty fine geographical resolution. So the resolutions that we've considered are, SA2, 3 and 4 and LGA, if people are familiar with the ASGS standards in Australia. But they're aggregate, geographical regions that are based on population density and features of populations in Australia. We've also considered grid data, but for visualization purposes in a proof of concept platform, grid data can be quite large. So we'll get there. But the idea is that there's a lot of data in Australia relating to environmental health, and a lot of organisations who deal with this data deal with it for a very short amount of time and as a once-off most of the time. This leads to a situation which we've termed siloing, where data is used for a little while and then stored away in a pocket or data storage system that's never accessed or used by anybody else. So we want to enable the ability for, three main groups of people to use and gain insight from that data. The first is policymakers, government making change, implementing mitigation strategies, researchers who will use the data to produce, statistically rigorous outputs, find conclusions, gain insights that way, and just the general public to be able to see and draw conclusions from data that's been collected. Great, and the idea, or the main focus is on seeing what population or what regions of population are more vulnerable than others, being able to do those kind of comparisons, So the solution is to develop spatial capabilities across all of those areas or for all of those people that I mentioned. We've got a pretty wide, set or wide scope for the project. But it's all to do with being able to integrate data that's aggregated or spatial with a whole range of other systems that are being developed at the same time. So this is known as a digital twin, infrastructure or system, dashboard, ecology, if you will, where all sorts of data about all sorts of things related to populations can be joined and assessed at once. So this is a small part of that in the grand scheme, but the capability is clear and there. In phase 1, though, we're taking a very narrow approach to just establishing what we can do with the data that is available to us, at first glance. And we're building a pilot digital twin to be able to establish some of those base capabilities of visualizing data, doing, small assessments, in a proof of concept, aiming for, where can we go from here? So I've got some specifics in there. We looked at a range of use cases in preparation for the platform. 2 of these that we ended up focusing on were air quality and extreme climates, so both heat and cold, and their impact on related human health. So extreme climate and its effect on things like cardiovascular disease, mortality, and associated things, air quality and asthma or COPD. We carried out a national data audit. So in that process, we went through a range of use cases, including things like vector-borne disease, arbovirus, etc., trying to establish what data sources exist in Australia that we could leverage for the first phase. Created some analysis and assessed, the lengths of data linkage that we could go through in a first phase. We'll talk about one of the analysis components, which is our vulnerability indices. And then we also looked at visualization tools. So how do we use the data that we have to give the most value to our future end users. We made a digital twin, or I guess we're making a digital twin, and then we'll be looking at road mapping to take the platform further. So I want to focus on vulnerability indices because they're, I don't know, quite an interesting aspect of the project. I've got a nice little graphic on the right-hand side there that really frames vulnerability as a combination of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. I've given some definitions on the left, but it's really how a population is impacted by an exposure and what their ability is to adapt or acclimatize or deal with that extreme exposure in some instances. So looking at, I guess, natural hazards like bushfires or heat waves. Cool. And what we do with that data is put it all together in some not really proprietary way. There are developing methods for vulnerability that have their strengths and weaknesses, so we're doing assessments of those, but I won't bore you with too many of the details. What I will bore you with, though, is some of the data that we're using. So in terms of the, I guess, association with epidemiology or infectious disease and the purpose for being here, one of the things we're looking at is how we combine things like exposure with population demographics and other factors like green space, water bodies, etc. So I've just got here, I guess, our 3 focus vulnerability indices, heat, cold, and air quality, which are a little bit small on the screen from the distance. Apologies, I'm very much used to online meetings where everyone is an inch away from their screen. But it really just shows the different parameters that we're considering and how they change, I guess, across our focus areas or our use cases. So in our exposure, we're just considering the core impact of the natural hazard that's occurring. So high amounts of nitrogen monoxide, ozone, etc. Or in the case of heat waves and high temperature. Adaptive capacity I mentioned second because it's our other small category, but these are things that let a population adapt or cope with a hazard. So things like hospitals, green space. It will be excellent to include things like cool places, like shopping centres, etc. But that data is not available to us at a glance, at least, which is why future phases of projects like this are so important. And then other things that are more demographic focused, like access to internet, access to a vehicle, which all influence the theme there, which is social connectedness. And then our larger category, which is sensitivity. This is based on things like the Social Vulnerability Index in America or the CIFA, the socioeconomic indexes for areas in Australia. And these are based on, I guess, pure demographics. So what makes a population vulnerable to natural hazards like this? And you can see the different ones we've used. Certain existing health outcomes were more relevant for heat or cold over air quality. We've done some investigating and found that some of these are likely to also contribute to the other cases, but for now, keeping it simple, getting an implementation, I guess, created. And the result is the creation of this platform that we're working on. So our vulnerability index assessment tool, this includes other indicators as well, rather than just our vulnerability indices. So I've got there our cold high percent, which is a spatial comparison across Australia of the coldest regions in a given month. I've cut that out. Oh no, it's month 3, 2001. So you can just see that in there. But the idea is so that you can get very quick access to information about, in this case, climate and extreme cold. And one interesting tidbit is that we discovered that the health impact of extreme cold is much, much more significant than extreme heat. So that's cool. In terms of challenges that we've faced when we're creating this, and this is, I guess, where the conversation comes into how the platform can be used and I guess how it's relevant to the community of policymakers, researchers, etc., is availability. So one of the things we looked at was what kind of data we wanted to be able to display in our proof of concepts. The last point in availability is an interesting challenge, which is how we look at both point data and spatial data together in analysis, and how we can use that to draw, I guess, fast insight, which is really the aim of the vulnerability indices, but it kind of extends through all of the data. If somebody's going to use the data to make insights like, these mitigation strategies or policy changes that I've talked about, they don't have a great amount of time to sit and focus specifically on environmental health over other policy areas that they're looking at. And so we need to be able to use a pretty wide wealth of data to be able to condense and get a point across and make impacts quite quickly. And so the idea of point data is great, but how do you combine that to give an overall sense of what's going on in a region compared to its neighbours, compared to the state, compared to a national scale? Other things that I've mentioned there are things like missing data. How do we deal with data that's available everywhere in Australia except for WA? What happens if there's just no data for a certain month or year for a certain parameter that we think is quite impactful? How do we deal with these things? And so those are things that we're considering as well. Excellent. And why here? So I guess the idea is that we want to be able to combine information, mentioned it a couple of times, but really influence how policy changes I guess motivated or justified. We want to be able to influence how researchers use data. And a big part of that is having data available. So promoting this idea of not siloing data. If there are systems like this or other systems like the digital twin infrastructure that I mentioned earlier, which aim to capture and reshare or make that data available for other users, I guess we want to be able to promote that idea. If you're working on data that's, infectious disease based and there's a way for other people to access that data and use that data, promoting the data availability and the resource itself is almost as important as discussing the results of your research, because making data available for other people to confer your work or to just see and gain insight from that data, I think is very important. And also because future phases of AusEnHealth, as I said before, we've considered mosquito-borne disease and infectious disease. We would also like to be able to incorporate that into future phases. So while our focuses at the moment are just climate and air quality, if any of you guys have national environmental health related data on mosquito-borne disease, or even subnational, like sub-state or state, then that would be great to incorporate as well. We've looked at, I guess, mosquito trap counts in WA using WA Department of Health data, even though it didn't make the cut for our first phase. So I guess that's some evidence that we're looking at exploring point data as well as our aggregate data that I've displayed, at least on the visualization. Great, so that's all that I have to talk about. I'll just flag, I'm not sure if the slides are accessible, but we've got a website for the project if people are interested in catching up, looking at, I guess, what we produce in the end result of our phase one, or just getting in contact. I guess all of my details are in relevant places as well. But I think it's all about networking and bringing everyone together. So I just want to kind of highlight that. But otherwise, thanks very much.